The sultry Tennessee air hung heavy on the morning of August 6, 1945. In a small cubicle at the Y-12 facility in Oak Ridge, Ruth Huddleston's delicate fingers hovered over the control panel of a massive electromagnetic device called a calutron. Outside, cicadas buzzed in the summer heat, but inside the climate-controlled building, 18-year-old Ruth focused intently on the dials before her, carefully adjusting knobs to keep the needles within their designated ranges. The fate of thousands, though she didn't know it yet, rested in the steadiness of her hands and the precision of her adjustments. 5,000 miles away above the Japanese city of Hiroshima, a modified B-29 bomber named Enola Gay released its payload at exactly 8:15 in the morning. As the bomb fell, uranium atoms that had passed through Ruth's calutron began their unstoppable chain reaction. 43 seconds later, a blinding flash of light erupted over the city, followed by a mushroom cloud that rose ominously into the morning sky. The world's first atomic weapon used in warfare had detonated with the destructive force of 15,000 tons of TNT. Back in Oak Ridge, Ruth and the other women working the calutrons continued their shifts, unaware that the fruits of their labor had just changed the course of human history forever. These young women, farm girls, high school graduates, sisters and daughters, had become an essential part of the most destructive weapon ever created, all without knowing what they were building. None of them knew that the uranium they had helped enrich would kill an estimated 80,000 people in an instant and leave tens of thousands more to suffer from radiation poisoning. No one in the Clinton engineer works knew that one woman's steady hand on the dials that morning had helped rewrite the rules of modern warfare. In the fall of 1942, Ruth Huddleston was just another teenager from Maynardville, Tennessee, a small rural community nestled in the rolling hills of the eastern part of the state. Her life consisted of church on Sundays, helping her mother with household chores, and dreaming of opportunities beyond the limited horizons of her hometown. Like many young Americans in the war years, Ruth wanted desperately to contribute to the fight against the Axis powers that had attacked Pearl Harbor and threatened freedom around the world. "I was 17 years old," Ruth would later recall, "and my friend wrote me a letter from Oak Ridge saying they were hiring people. They were recruiting all over, and I wanted to help with the war effort." Ruth had never traveled far from home before, but the promise of good wages and the patriotic call to serve her country beckoned. In December 1944, she boarded a bus to a place that didn't appear on any maps, a secret city built by the United States government in less than 18 months. What Ruth found upon arrival was astonishing. A bustling community of 75,000 people living in a city that officially didn't exist. Oak Ridge, also known as the Clinton Engineer Works, featured dormitories for single workers, houses for families, schools, theaters, churches, and massive industrial complexes surrounded by fences and guarded by armed soldiers. Billboards throughout the facility proclaimed, "What you see here, what you do here, what you hear here, when you leave here, let it stay here." Ruth's background was typical of the women recruited to work at Oak Ridge. She had graduated high school, but had no specialized scientific training. She was intelligent, detail-oriented, and most importantly, willing to follow instructions without asking too many questions. The Tennessee Eastman Corporation, which operated the Y-12 facility, saw these qualities as perfect for the job they needed done. They told us during the interview that what we would be doing was crucial to ending the war, Ruth remembered, but they couldn't tell us what it was. They said we'd be working with machines, and that was all we needed to know. After 3 weeks of training, Ruth joined thousands of other young women, later nicknamed the Calutron Girls, who would operate the mysterious devices that separated uranium isotopes. These women came from farms and small towns across Tennessee, Kentucky, Alabama, and other southern states. They shared dormitories, ate in cafeterias, and spent their shifts monitoring equipment they didn't understand for a purpose they couldn't imagine. What none of them knew was that they had become critical components in the most expensive and secret scientific project in human history, the Manhattan Project. Their steady hands and careful attention would prove more valuable than anyone could have predicted, even outperforming the nation's most brilliant scientific minds. Ruth couldn't have imagined that her daily work would contribute to a weapon that would kill instantly and cast a shadow over human existence for generations to come. She had no idea that soon those instincts would be all that stood between success and failure for the most ambitious weapons program in history. To understand how Ruth Huddleston and thousands of other young women became unwitting architects of atomic warfare, we must look back to the early days of World War II, when fears of a Nazi atomic bomb spurred the United States into action. In 1939, with war spreading across Europe, Hungarian-born physicist Leo Szilard became increasingly concerned that Nazi Germany might develop an atomic weapon. Along with fellow physicist Eugene Wigner, Szilard drafted a letter warning of this possibility and convinced the world's most famous scientist, Albert Einstein, to sign it. The letter, delivered to President Franklin Roosevelt in August 1939, warned of the potential development of extremely powerful bombs of a new type and urged the United States to secure uranium ore and accelerate nuclear research. Roosevelt responded by establishing the Advisory Committee on Uranium, which began modest funding for nuclear research. However, progress remained slow until late 1941, when the arrival of the British Maud Committee report changed everything. This report indicated that a bomb using just 5 to 10 kilograms of pure uranium-235 could produce an explosion equivalent to thousands of tons of conventional explosives, and that such a bomb was feasible within years, not decades. With America's entry into World War II after the Pearl Harbor attack in December 1941, uranium research took on new urgency. In September 1942, Brigadier General Leslie Groves was appointed to lead what would become the Manhattan Project, the code name for America's crash program to build an atomic bomb. Groves, an Army Corps of Engineers officer who had recently completed construction of the Pentagon, brought organizational discipline and relentless drive to the project. His first major decision was selecting physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer to lead the scientific effort at Los Alamos, New Mexico. Oppenheimer assembled an extraordinary team of scientists from across the United States and Europe, many of them refugees who had fled Nazi persecution. The challenge before them was staggering. Natural uranium contains less than 1% uranium-235, the isotope capable of sustaining the chain reaction needed for a bomb. The rest is uranium-238, which cannot. Separating these isotopes on a scale sufficient for weapons production had never been attempted. Multiple methods for uranium enrichment were pursued simultaneously, as no one knew which would prove most efficient. At Oak Ridge, 3 massive industrial facilities were constructed to house these different enrichment processes: Y12 for electromagnetic separation, K25 for gaseous diffusion, and S50 for liquid thermal diffusion. The electromagnetic separation process at Y12 was based on a device called a calutron, developed by physicist Ernest Lawrence at the University of California, Berkeley. Named after the California University cyclotron, these machines used powerful magnets to separate uranium isotopes based on their slightly different masses. The science behind it was actually quite elegant, explained physicist Henry Morgan, who worked on calutron development. When uranium atoms are ionized and sent through a magnetic field, the heavier and lighter isotopes follow different paths due to their different masses. The uranium-235 atoms, being slightly lighter, curve more sharply and can be collected separately from the uranium-238. Lawrence's team had demonstrated the principle on a small scale at Berkeley, but scaling up to industrial production required building hundreds of calutrons arranged in massive oval configurations nicknamed racetracks. The first Alpha Calutron began operation in January 1944, with the goal of enriching uranium from its natural state to about 15% uranium-235. This partially enriched material would then be further processed in beta calutrons to reach the roughly 80% enrichment needed for a weapon. Operating these calutrons required constant monitoring and adjustment. Initial plans called for trained scientists and engineers to perform this task, but the rapid expansion of the war effort created severe personnel shortages. This personnel crisis led to one of the Manhattan Project's most significant improvisations, the recruitment of young women, mostly recent high school graduates, to operate the calutrons. Kenneth Nichols, the Army's manager at Oak Ridge, later wrote, "We faced an impossible situation. We needed hundreds of operators immediately, but there weren't enough physicists in the entire country to staff the facility. Someone suggested trying local girls, and out of desperation, we agreed." Ernest Lawrence initially objected, believing that only scientifically trained personnel could properly operate his complex machines. He reluctantly agreed to a trial, expecting the hillbilly girls, as some dismissively called them, to struggle with the sophisticated equipment. What happened next would become one of the great ironies of the Manhattan Project, a moment when conventional wisdom about expertise and formal education was turned on its head by the practical intelligence and disciplined focus of young women from rural America. In March 1944, Colonel Kenneth Nichols made a startling discovery while reviewing production data from the Y-12 facility. The Calutrons operated by the young women from Tennessee and neighboring states were consistently outperforming those run by Lawrence's team of PhD physicists from Berkeley. "I couldn't believe what I was seeing," Nichols recalled. "These girls with high school diplomas were producing more enriched uranium than the scientists with advanced degrees." When confronted with this information, Lawrence insisted that his scientists must be experimenting with improvements to the process, not focusing solely on production. Nichols proposed a contest, a direct comparison between the scientists and the young women. Over the course of 1 week, both groups would operate identical calutrons under the same conditions, with production of enriched uranium as the sole metric of success. The results weren't even close. The calutron girls soundly outperformed the scientists, achieving higher production rates with fewer machine failures. What accounted for this unexpected outcome? The answer revealed a profound truth about the nature of technological mastery and the difference between theoretical understanding and practical application. Colonel Nichols explained it this way. The scientists understood how the calutrons worked and were constantly trying to improve them, tinkering with settings, looking for optimal configurations. When something went wrong, they'd stop to analyze the problem, run calculations, debate possible solutions. Meanwhile, the young women had been trained to watch the dials, adjust the knobs within specific parameters, and call their supervisor immediately if something went beyond their authority to fix. They focused entirely on the task at hand without questioning or analyzing. In this particular context, that approach proved far more effective. Ruth Huddleston described her work. "We sat on stools in our cubicles watching these meters with needles that would fluctuate. Our job was to keep the needles in the right position by adjusting the knobs. If they got too far out of range, we'd call for help. We didn't know what the machines did, but we knew our job was to keep those needles steady." The women had developed an almost intuitive feel for the machines, noticing subtle changes in dial readings that might indicate potential problems before they became serious. Their lack of scientific knowledge proved an asset. Rather than theorizing about what might be happening inside the calutron, they focused entirely on the empirical evidence of the dials and gauges before them. This victory of practical operation over theoretical knowledge wasn't just a curiosity, it had profound implications for the Manhattan Project's timeline. The increased efficiency achieved by the calutron girls accelerated uranium production, potentially shaving weeks or months off the development of the first atomic bomb. By July 1945, the combined efforts of the Y-12, K-25, and S-50 plants had produced about 50 kilograms of highly enriched uranium, just enough for a single atomic bomb. This precious material was carefully transported to Los Alamos, where it would be fashioned into the core of the Little Boy device. But the women who had helped create this material remained completely unaware of its purpose. They continued adjusting dials and watching meters, their disciplined focus never wavering, despite the monotony and secrecy of their work. Ruth noticed that those who asked too many questions about what they were doing often disappeared from their positions. "You learned pretty quickly not to be too curious," she said. "People who talked too much or asked questions just weren't there the next day. We figured they'd been fired, but nobody knew for sure." They had been fighting with rules that an enemy could afford to break, and yet somehow these rules, secrecy, discipline, unquestioning execution of duties, had helped create a weapon that would soon bring that enemy to its knees. While Ruth Huddleston and her fellow Calitron girls worked their shifts at Oak Ridge, scientists at Los Alamos were racing to transform the enriched uranium into a functional weapon. The design for what would become the Little Boy device was relatively straightforward compared to the plutonium-based Fat Man bomb being developed in parallel. Little Boy used a gun-type design where one piece of uranium was fired into another to create a critical mass capable of sustaining a nuclear chain reaction. Lieutenant Commander Francis Birch led the team at Los Alamos responsible for the Little Boy design. The gun-type design had the advantage of simplicity, Birch explained in post-war interviews. We had high confidence it would work without a full-scale test, which was crucial since we had only enough enriched uranium for a single bomb. The design consisted of a gun barrel inside the bomb casing with a uranium bullet at one end and a uranium target at the other. When the bomb detonated, conventional explosives would fire the bullet down the barrel into the target, creating a supercritical mass that would trigger the nuclear explosion. By late July 1945, the components of Little Boy had been transported to Tinian Island in the Pacific, the forward base for the 509th Composite Group, the specialized B-29 unit trained to deliver atomic weapons. There, under the supervision of Captain William Deke Parsons, the bomb was assembled and prepared for its historic mission. On the morning of August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, took off from Tinian carrying Little Boy. After a 6-hour flight, the bomber reached Hiroshima, a Japanese military hub that had largely escaped the conventional bombing campaigns that had devastated other Japanese cities. At exactly 8:15 local time, Little Boy was released from the bomb bay. It fell for 43 seconds before detonating approximately 1,900 feet above the city center. The blast instantly released energy equivalent to approximately 15,000 tons of TNT, creating a fireball that reached temperatures comparable to the sun's surface. The destruction was immediate and overwhelming. Buildings within a 1-mile radius were obliterated. The blast wave shattered windows as far as 12 miles away. Fires ignited throughout the city, merging into a firestorm that consumed everything in its path. Between 70,000 and 80,000 people died instantly, with tens of thousands more suffering severe injuries and radiation exposure that would claim additional lives in the days, weeks, and years that followed. 3 days later, a second atomic bomb, the plutonium-based Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki. On August 15th, Japan announced its surrender, bringing World War II to a close. Back at Oak Ridge, the news of the atomic bombings and the revelation of what they had been working on came as a profound shock to Ruth and her colleagues. "I found out the day after they bombed Japan," Ruth later recalled. "Someone came in and said, well, they've dropped the bomb, and they told us that's what we'd been working on. We were making material for the atomic bomb. That's the first time we knew." The women's reactions were complex. Pride in helping end the war mixed with horror at the devastating power they had helped unleash. "I was happy because I thought it would bring my boyfriend home from Germany," Ruth said. "But it bothered me that I had a part in killing so many people. It was a hard thing to take." For many of the Calitron girls, their contribution to history remained largely unrecognized for decades. As the Cold War intensified, the secrecy surrounding the Manhattan Project continued. Most returned to traditional roles as wives and mothers, seldom speaking about their wartime work, partly out of lingering security concerns and partly because few would believe their stories. The mathematics of victory were written in the careful adjustments of thousands of young women who never knew the equations they were solving or the deadly product they were creating. Their contribution demonstrates how ordinary Americans, given extraordinary responsibilities, rose to meet the challenges of their time with quiet dignity and unwavering dedication. In 1991, with the Cold War ending, the Department of Energy began declassifying Manhattan Project records, allowing the full story of Oak Ridge and the Calitron girls to emerge. Historians and journalists started documenting their experiences, bringing overdue recognition to these unsung heroines of World War II. Denise Kiernan's 2013 book, The Girls of Atomic City, brought wider public attention to their story. "These women represent a fascinating intersection of American history," Kiernan observed. They were part of the greatest scientific undertaking of the 20th century, yet they had no idea what they were building. They were pioneering women in the workforce during a time of dramatic social change, and they were at ground zero of the atomic age that would reshape global politics for generations. The legacy of the Calutron girls extends beyond their contribution to ending World War II. They demonstrated that technical proficiency doesn't always require advanced education, that disciplined focus can sometimes outperform theoretical knowledge, and that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when united in purpose. Ruth Huddleston's life after the war followed a pattern similar to many of her colleagues. She married, raised children, and rarely spoke about her time at Oak Ridge until historians began documenting the Manhattan Project decades later. When she did begin sharing her experiences, she offered a perspective on the atomic bombings that reflected both pride in her contribution to ending the war and ambivalence about the terrible destruction it caused. "I'm proud I helped end the war and bring our boys home," she said in an interview shortly before her death in 2020. "But I've always been troubled by the loss of life. I console myself with the thought that the alternative, an invasion of Japan, would have cost even more lives on both sides. Still, it's a heavy thing to carry, knowing you helped create something with such destructive power." Today, the Y-12 National Security Complex continues to operate in Oak Ridge, though its mission has evolved. The facility now focuses on nuclear security, storage of nuclear materials, and supporting the nation's nuclear deterrent. In 2010, the Manhattan Project National Historical Park was established to preserve key sites at Oak Ridge, Los Alamos, and Hanford, ensuring that future generations will remember this pivotal moment in history. The Calutrons that Ruth and her colleagues operated have long since been dismantled, with the exception of the Beta 3 units, which were used for medical isotope production until the 1990s. The massive buildings that housed them stand as monuments to American industrial might and scientific ingenuity. Visitors to Oak Ridge can tour the American Museum of Science and Energy, which includes exhibits on the Manhattan Project and the role of the Calutron girls. What makes the story of Ruth Huddleston and the Calutron girls so compelling is not just their technical accomplishment, but the moral complexity of their unwitting contribution to nuclear warfare. They represent the thousands of ordinary Americans whose combined efforts created a weapon of unprecedented destructive power, a weapon that both ended the most destructive war in human history and ushered in an age of existential nuclear anxiety that continues to this day. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki remain among the most controversial military actions in American history. Proponents argue they saved countless lives by preventing a protracted invasion of Japan. Critics question whether alternatives might have achieved Japanese surrender without such devastating loss of civilian life. This debate continues among historians, ethicists, and military strategists, with no clear consensus emerging after more than 7 decades. What is beyond dispute is that the Manhattan Project represented an inflection point in human history, the moment when humankind acquired the ability to destroy itself. The nuclear weapons created at Los Alamos, using material processed at Oak Ridge and Hanford, fundamentally altered international relations, military strategy, and humanity's relationship with technology. For Ruth Huddleston and the other Calutron girls, their place in this pivotal historical moment was a product of circumstance, being the right age, in the right place, at the right time, with the right combination of skills and temperament. They didn't choose to help create atomic weapons. They chose to serve their country during wartime, to earn wages that supported their families, and to fulfill their duties to the best of their abilities. In this, they embodied the spirit of the greatest generation, ordinary Americans rising to meet extraordinary challenges without fanfare or expectation of recognition. Their story reminds us that history is made not just by great scientists, generals, and political leaders, but by countless individuals whose names rarely appear in textbooks, but whose combined efforts shape the course of human events. As we reflect on the atomic age that began with the flash above Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, we should remember not only the brilliant minds that unlocked the secrets of the atom, but also the steady hands that helped transform scientific theory into military reality. The Calutron girls stand as a testament to the often overlooked contributions of women to technological achievement and military success, contributions that have frequently been minimized or erased in historical accounts. The world we inhabit today, with its complex web of nuclear treaties, proliferation concerns, and deterrence strategies, was born in part from the careful adjustments made by young women in cubicles at Oak Ridge. Their story offers a window into a pivotal moment when science, warfare, and industrial might converge to create a technology that would forever change the calculus of international conflict. In the decades since World War II, nuclear weapons have never again been used in warfare, though their shadow looms over every major international crisis. The doctrine of mutual assured destruction, the understanding that nuclear war would leave no winners, only survivors, has helped prevent another global conflict on the scale of World War II, even as regional wars and terrorist threats have proliferated. The technology developed during the Manhattan Project has found peaceful applications as well. Nuclear power plants generate electricity for millions of homes and businesses worldwide. Medical isotopes, some produced in the same calutrons that once enriched uranium for weapons, help diagnose and treat diseases. Nuclear physics has advanced our understanding of the fundamental nature of matter and energy. Yet the dual nature of nuclear technology, its capacity for both tremendous benefit and horrific destruction, remains as profound a dilemma today as it was in 1945. This duality is reflected in the complex legacy of the Manhattan Project and the mixed emotions expressed by many of those who participated in it, including the Calutron girls. As one of the last surviving Calutron girls said in a 2018 interview, "We were just doing our jobs, trying to help win the war. None of us could have imagined what we were really part of, both the end of one terrible war and the beginning of a whole new kind of danger for the world. I hope people understand that we were ordinary folks caught up in extraordinary times, doing what we thought was right." The secret work at Oak Ridge, the careful separation of uranium isotopes by young women who didn't know what they were creating, serves as a powerful metaphor for the atomic age itself, humanity's ability to harness fundamental forces of nature without fully comprehending the long-term consequences of doing so. Would you have made different choices had you known what you were building? This is the question that haunts many Manhattan Project veterans and, by extension, challenges us all to consider our own moral responsibility for the technologies we develop and deploy, especially when their full implications may not be immediately apparent. As the generation that built and used the first atomic weapons passes into history, their stories take on new significance. They remind us of both human ingenuity and human fallibility, of noble intentions and troubling outcomes, of scientific triumph and ethical ambiguity. In the hands of Ruth Huddleston and thousands like her, we see reflected both the best of American character, dedication, resourcefulness, teamwork, and the profound moral questions that arise when these virtues are channeled toward creating weapons of mass destruction. The legacy of the Calutron girls and the Manhattan Project invites us to consider how ordinary people respond when asked to participate in extraordinary endeavors with far-reaching consequences. It challenges us to reflect on our own responsibilities as citizens, workers, and human beings in a world where technological power continues to expand, sometimes outpacing our ethical frameworks for managing it wisely. Share this story of unsung American heroines who changed the course of history through their dedication, discipline, and unwavering focus. Women whose careful hands helped end a world war while unknowingly ushering in the atomic age that shapes our world to this day.